ago, I was visiting on a Saturday. I was visiting a few friends of mine. There's a hodgepodge of people. I was visiting some Christian, some Jews. This is right in the middle of Hanukkah, by the way, as well. And the one person I was having a conversation with asked this question, which I think I told you about. They asked the question, are you going to have Christmas midnight mass at your church? And I turned my nose like this, like I was smelling a bad odor, and shook my head from side to side, and it was like, no, we don't do that. And then, of course, you can see the person's like puzzled. I said, no, we're Protestants, we don't do that. But in any event, I made the fatal mistake of asking this person, do you really want to know about Christmas? And the answer was yes, and I said, well, wait a minute, before I tell you, are you really sure you want to know? In other words, kind of like Jack in the movie, you can't handle the truth. Do you really want to know the truth? Of course, this person said yes. I said, well, okay. So when people talk about Christmas time, the first issue you're going to have to deal with is going to be the word, the etymology. Now, don't think this whole message is going to be on etymology, because it's not. But let me just give you this for those of you that are hearing this for the first time. If you break the word Christmas in half, you have from Christmas, from Christ, from Christos in the Greek, from the Hebrew Meshua, which our English word is Messiah, and Mass. The two words, it is a compound, the two words, Mass, as a verb to gather together, as intransitive, as a noun, a lump, size, or quantity, from the Latin massa, which means to knead dough. From the Greek maza, barley cake. From the Proto-Indo-European root mag, to knead. And this word, being used in the Latin, was always used at the end of the Mass when people were being dismissed. Missing link here. Its first appearance in the English language, Old English, is 1038 as Christ Mesa, and as Christ Massa in 1130 or so in Old English. So in terms of the development of the word, you're going to have to use your brain a little bit as to how you could call this the celebration of the birth of Christ a Christ Mass. Even if you took the most liturgical term, there's a disconnect. And the reason why I'm highlighting this, because I think it's super important, but the reason I'm highlighting this is because we know certain things are not being connected by the average person reading these accounts. Let me tell you what dots I connect. When we read about God's set times in the Old Testament, we read about God's set times in the book of Leviticus in the 23rd chapter, regarding these set times. For example, the Passover is a set time. It's the Lord's Passover. It is the commemoration of when the children of Israel were delivered out of Egypt's bondage. And we read that that is to be kept as a perpetual commemoration of the event. That is in Leviticus 23. And 1 Corinthians 5:7, we're told Christ is our Passover. So you've always got what God laid out in the Old Testament and a fulfillment in the New. So please tell me, where does Christmas fit into an Old Testament? We're not talking prophecy now. Many things were prophetically foretold about the coming of our Lord, the coming of John the Baptist, all of these things in prophecy. But what does this embody? What is the fulfillment? And no one has said what the fulfillment is. Now, if you go down all of the set times, which I will get back to, you recognize that what happens in our mind, because we live in this culture and society, we're not looking at a Hebrew mindset from an Old Testament. There was no New Testament. When Jesus was born, there was no New Testament. Do you all agree on that? Yes. That means that everything that was the Old Testament was the only testament. And that Old Testament was the roadmap to tell us about what was happening. So, a few things dawned on me. What we need to do is we need to first look at the narrative in Luke's gospel for a specific reason, and then we will look at it in Matthew. So while you're turning there, I'd like the ushers to come. I've prepared a small handout for you for those people who are hard-headed like me and deliberately didn't pass it out beforehand, because then you'd be sitting there looking at it. Right? All the ADD would be kicking in. So don't bother your neighbor right now. Turn in your Bibles to the first chapter of Luke, and I want you to read with me. I'm going to read this. Follow along, please. First chapter of Luke and verse 5. And remember that Luke set out, he says, to put everything in order. There was in the days of Herod, king of Judea, a certain priest named Zacharias of the course of Abiah. And his wife was the daughter of Aaron, and her name was Elizabeth. Now, once you get your handout, I'll explain why this handout is really very handy. I want you to be able to hold on to it. Let me read through the whole thing first. They were both righteous before God, walking in all the commandments and ordinances of the Lord, blameless. They had no child because that Elizabeth was barren. They were both well stricken in years. And let me say there's this lovely parallel. Remember, there was no New Testament. So it's not as though Luke was saying, I want to write something and make it sound like something else. It's a remarkable parallel universe to other Old Testament saints. Abram and Sarai, well stricken in age, barren. We've got a lot of these people, the record of God taking people who were past the age of childbearing and gifting them with children. So, here's another one of these. It came to pass that while he executed the priest's office before God in the order of his course, according to the custom of the priest's office, his lot, his responsibility in his service was to burn incense when he went into the temple of the Lord. Now, the whole multitude of people were praying without at the time of incense. There appeared unto him the angel of the Lord, standing on the right side of the altar of incense. And when you read this, if you're familiar with some Old Testament pictures, you're immediately going to think this is shades of Daniel. This is shades of things we've read before, where the Lord appears to somebody in the hour of prayer. And when Zacharias saw him, he was troubled. Fear fell upon him. The angel said to him, Fear not, Zacharias, for thy prayer is heard. Thy wife Elizabeth shall bear thee a son. Thou shalt call his name John. Now, I'd like to know what you would do if an angel appeared to you and told you that, and you are well past the age of being able to do anything, let alone to produce anything. That will hit you a little later. And thou shalt have joy and gladness. Well, I'll say. Because this child was going to be produced the old-fashioned way. This isn't like a virgin birth here. You're going to have joy and gladness. Don't you like the way I read the Bible? Many shall rejoice at his birth. He shall be great in the sight of the Lord. He shall drink neither wine nor strong drink, and shall be filled with the Holy Ghost, even from his mother's womb. And we've got this incredible picture in verse 17. And he shall go before him in the spirit and power of Elijah, to turn the hearts of the fathers to the children, and the disobedient to the wisdom of the just, to make ready a people prepared for the Lord. And of course, if you follow this all the way through, I'm going to jump over because I'm going to run short of time. So I'm going to jump over to where he is done with his service. In verse 23, it came to pass that as soon as the days of his ministration, that is his service in the temple, were accomplished, he departed to his own house. And after those days, his wife Elizabeth conceived and hid herself 5 months. Now, if you look on your handout, I want you to take a look at something. We saw in 1:5 where it says, and for some of you who've been around a long time, make like you're interested, all right? Just make like it. Some of you. All right. In that 5th verse where it says the course of Abiah, which is Greek for Abijah. So what I've done here is I've put down let me go over to my place here where I can point. And what I've done is I've put down here, you've got all the courses of the priests. There were 24 of them. We'll talk about those in a minute. And here you're going to see this 8th course right here, Abijah. And I say this is the course, this is the one in Luke 1:5, Abijah, the Greek. So I want you to take a look at what month this occurs. It's the month on the Hebrew calendar of Tammuz. That is the equivalent of June or July for our calendar. And you've got to remember this. This is this crazy thing that most people fail to do. When they begin to reckon time, they want to reckon it by the calendar that we currently use. You cannot do that. And I'll tell you why as well in a moment. You cannot do that. So anything we're talking about regarding the Hebrew service, the Hebrew festivities, the Hebrew month, must be calculated in their time, not in ours. So what you have is you've got this record right here that we just read in Luke 1:5, telling you what course that Zacharias was serving in. Now, what's kind of interesting is if you look on your second page, you'll find it in blue. I did that to kind of highlight. And I also gave you the names, translation of the names of the people, what their names mean. So let's take a look at this and see if this works. If the course of Abijah happened in the month of Tammuz, which is June, July, I want you to see that immediately afterwards we have something of a record here. It says, after the days of his ministration were accomplished, verse 23, he departed to his own house. And after those days, his wife Elizabeth conceived and hid herself 5 months. So after those days, we know for certain that after those days, don't worry, if I fall, I'm going to fall on the camera. After those days would be after the days of Abijah. He didn't, excuse me for being colloquial here, but they didn't do anything until he was done doing what he was supposed to do. You get what I'm saying? So he had to get home first, which doesn't matter how far you envision that he lived, he still had to get home to do the other thing that he was told was going to happen. So, all right, here we go. So assuming then that after he finishes this is the 8th course which he served in, it means in Tish B'Av, in Av, Menachem, July or August is the first month. We'll see if I counted these out for you. Let's see what happens here. So we have, this would be 1, Av, 1, Elul, 2 months pregnant, Tishrei, 3 months pregnant, Sheshvan, 4 months pregnant, Kislev, 5, Tevet, 6, Shivat, 7, Adar, 8, 9 months. Isn't that did it change, folks? Oh God, help us. Only 3 people knew the answer. That's why I put typical 9 months for a normal child there, right on the top. We have the birth of John the Baptist in the month of Nisan, which if you go back to read anything in Exodus, you may find that this month is also called the month of Abib. Nisan and Abib are the same months. So this is the time Passover is celebrated. That puts you into Passover. March, April is the time of Passover. So let's take a look at something, and I have to go back and forth here. Let's take a look at something. It says in our record here, she was 5 months pregnant. 5, when she hid herself. You're reading the same Bible as I am, right? 5 months. Now, in the 6th month, read verse 26, and in the 6th month, the angel Gabriel was sent from God. That is not the 6th calendar month. That is the 6th month of Elizabeth's pregnancy. And we know that's the 6th month of Elizabeth's pregnancy because it's going to be confirmed again in verse 36. And this is the 6th month with her who was called barren. So you read she was 5 months pregnant, and in the 6th month, and this is relevant because we know 6 months afterwards, after John the Baptist, Jesus is born. So these are put in for good reason. Now, if you want to follow the line of thinking, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 months she hid herself. 6 months, at the 6-month mark, where I just read from, putting it in Tevet, December or January equivalent. That's the time approximately of Hanukkah, floating time there. So then we would have 7, 8, 9, John the Baptist is born, Passover. And why is this such an important thing to note first? Because noting when John the Baptist is born will give us a correct time for Jesus' birth. But before you start doing that, I want you to entertain me for a minute. And just entertain this line of thinking. I don't think it's an accident. Most people don't know the traditions in the celebration of the Passover Seder, in the traditional celebration of the Passover. The Jews traditionally there are 5 special cups of wine that are poured throughout the course of the Seder. The 5th one is called the cup of Elijah. It's filled with wine. Usually it's a special cup, a silver cup. It's filled with wine. It's put on the table. And usually the youngest member of the household will go and open the front door to let the spirit of Elijah into the house. Now, you can do whatever you want with that, but I don't think it's an accident that here we have John the Baptist being born on Passover, and the references to John the Baptist being equated to Elijah are manifold. They come to him in John's gospel and they say, are you the Christ? No. Are you Elijah? No. Honestly, there's this great parallel between John the Baptist and Elijah. Who else? Take a look at Elijah, speaking against the kings and standing with the word of God. And here's the forerunner to Christ standing and clearing the way for the word of God to stand in full glory and splendor that can be seen by all. And of course, that costs him his head. So if you're thinking of taking up a career in preaching. But the point is, I love these. They're even microcosms of fulfillments within the set times of God. So, now, we know 6 months later, Jesus is born. Let's go back to the drawing board here. And most of you who know this, you might say that's great, but there's a lot of people who haven't heard this, who, they're like me, they have to see it. And then once you see it, you're going to say, well, okay, there must be something else wrong with what you're saying. All right, so now we have John the Baptist being born, and let's count 6 months. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Christ is born. That puts him born in September, October, in the month of Tishrei. And what's so relevant about Christ being born in this month? We have Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and Sukkot. Rosh Hashanah begins the new year. Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. And Sukkot, the Feast of Booths. And what's quite relevant is within a 15-day period in the Jewish calendar, you've got a whole bunch of stuff happening. I just named a few of them, starting with the Feast of Trumpets. Now, I happen to believe that the first heralding, if you will, of Christ's birth, heralded to the angels, coincides with that trumpet blowing. And I believe the rest of it is fulfilled in tabernacles. John says that Jesus took up a tent, if you will, of human flesh and tabernacle, dwelt among us. Now, why is this so radical, and why is it important as Christians that we should know and separate the pagan ideas from the true meaning revealed by God? Because if Christ is not only the embodiment of the first trumpet and embodying, obviously, and fulfilling the great atonement, the final atonement, but tabernacles. Why is this important? I'll come back to that because I don't think you really want to know right now. I'll come back to that. Now, okay, I'll tell you. Because the book of Zechariah tells us that when Jesus returns, Zechariah 14, when Jesus returns for 1,000 years, he will force all of those. It says the nations. It's not just limited to Jews. It's going to be Jews and Gentiles. He's going to force the people for 1,000 years to celebrate the Feast of Tabernacles. And I don't really believe it's just limited to the 203 sacrifices. He is going to force them to see he tabernacled among them one time previously, in the fulfillment in the final days, with the last trump being blown, will be the final tabernacling, if you will, before mankind. So if there's a greater meaning somewhere, and there is a greater meaning somewhere, it falls right there. Now, not done. Don't think I'm done. Because a lot of people say, you know, what you're saying is really great, but you sound like maybe you had a little bit too much Fruit Loops this morning. So let's examine some other things, as well as the course of the priests, as well as there are so many different areas I could pierce and talk about. Let me first talk about. Let's find something good to read out of. Too much stuff here, too much paper. Let's first start with history. Because some of you may not like my calculations right there. But that's why I put them on paper, so you could look at them and be mad at me for the rest of the year. Oh, she ruined it for me. Now listen, what have I told you? If the people around you don't want to hear the truth, I now realize that I've probably alienated a few people 2 weeks ago because they were looking forward to doing whatever. Now I've even planted the seed of doubt in their mind. And I wasn't trying to be a killjoy. If you can understand something, that he wasn't born at that time, and I could even turn my back for a minute if the rest of the world would really be celebrating Christ. I'm tired of hearing people say, put Christ back into Christmas, when the reality is most people out there in the shopping malls and the people who are cutting you off and flipping you off don't care about Jesus, the reason for the season, as they'd like to say. They only care about one thing, and it's what it has become in terms of commercialism, in terms of greed. And historically, you know, there's the other missing part of this. You can't just go and say, well, look at these things here. There's some other great things to look at if you're going to go peeling back. From the time of John's death, John, the writer of the Gospels, Revelation, and the books named after him, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, will say that he died somewhere around 98 or 99 at best AD, all right? So let's round off some numbers. From 100 to the year 325, in history books, history of the Christian church, this is the gold standard, Schaff. You don't get any more gold standard than this, whether you're a Protestant or a Catholic. This is the gold standard of the history of the Christian church. You will not find in the first volume, which is dated 100 to 325, you'll find no reference to Christmas, not a one. You have to go outside of these books to other writers of the time. And somebody may say, well, you talked about John the Baptist's birth to set the time for Jesus' birth. Why are the infancy narratives and the genealogies so important? Because by the year 200, a man named Tertullian, writing in North Africa, was already combating stories that were being propagated primarily by the Jewish community of the illegitimate child, Jesus. And the story went that Jesus' mother became pregnant by messing around with a man named Panthera, what a name, and Joseph the carpenter, finding out that his wife had been unfaithful, drove her out of the house. She had her child. Jesus then grows up, goes to Egypt, learns magic, perfects and becomes proficient at magic, and calls himself a god, returns to his hometown, calls himself a god. And this is not just one random thing over here. This is being propagated. In fact, this began to be propagated in 177 by a man named Celsus, who, when you read the church father Origen, is combating Celsus and his heresies. But this was widely preached. This was widely propagated. So you've got to go to the church history to find out in 325 and after. Constantine is now emperor of Rome and has his conversion. Whether you want to believe the conversion story or not, that's your business. Has his conversion, and Christianity now is not only acceptable and tolerated, but becomes basically the religion that is the preferred religion of Rome. And we know that it's at that time that many of these customs, many of these traditions begin to be grafted on. So if you're looking for church history, the first real hardcore date for Christmas being celebrated as a holiday is brought in about 354 in Rome. That's kind of one of those dates that you look for. And you find that initially it was brought in by a heretic, by the way. And this is what is always, people get this all messed up. If you're looking at history, you're not going to find Christmas being celebrated before, hard date before 354 as a hard date. Now it was circulating, but here's the problem, which most people don't understand. The problem is the early church was not concerned with Christ's birth. Now I want you to hear what I'm saying. I believe in the virgin birth. I believe that Jesus was born of a virgin. I do not believe in the perpetual virginity of Mary. You can go to the Proto-Evangelium of James to read those wild stories that propagated the concept of the perpetual virginity of Mary. Now, let me ask you a question. If you're reading the gospel accounts, why is it if Mary is, we're not basing her virginity when she gave birth to the Christ child, but if there was something more to Mary as an intercessor, why does Jesus almost completely disavow when they say, your mother and your brothers are here? Who was my mother and who are my brothers? Does that sound like he was venerating her or that she was venerated by anyone when he basically says, who is she? In other words, who is my mother and who are my brothers? So we've got this bent to take things and twist them. And that's why I said through history, we can glean many things. Now, don't go saying, wow, Pastor Scott, you got some wild ideas. Well, they're not all mine, by the way. This is the Bible Almanac. I tried to pick some stuff that wasn't as loopy looking, because some of you who've been around a long time, you read this, The Two Babylons, or the Papal Worship. This is by the late Reverend Alexander Hislop. Although absolutely true, if you read it for the first time and you're not sure about what you're reading, you're going to think this guy had too much Fruit Loops as well. I'm sorry, I'm telling, because when I first read this, I was like, oh, no, sorry. Okay, so you have to be a little bit more mature in your thinking to be able to digest this. So we're going with the safer Bible Almanac. A little more black and white for you there. All right, and it definitely is a black and white book. All right, here we go. Let me read you a few things coming from a very straight-laced book. We don't know the exact month and day when Jesus was born. The date of December 25th is not very likely. The church in Rome chose that day to celebrate his birth in the 2nd or 3rd century in order to obscure a thoroughly pagan holiday that was traditionally celebrated on that day. Earlier, the Eastern Orthodox Church chose to honor Christ's birthday on January 6th, Epiphany. But why set the date in the winter? Listen to what these people say. The shepherds would have been least likely to tend their flocks on the hillsides at that time. More likely, Jesus was born in the fall or the spring. So, and if you really want to read on, there's a really nice chapter right here, which gives you this whole section about the date of Christmas, which if I have time, I will read to you. That being said, come on now, I've got some other good things to share with you. Don't look like you're already falling asleep. The Dictionary of Christian Lore and Legend by J.C.J. Metford, which basically says kind of the same thing and ties together a few other things I said earlier. Christmas, The English name for the Feast of Nativity, Middle English Christes Masses, or Mass, the festival Mass of Christ. There is no scriptural warrant for the celebration of the birth of Jesus on December 25th, nor is there any precise indication of the day in which the birth narratives of the Gospels, Luke and Matthew, give. Speculation as to the time of the year is not evident, and so it's basically just confirming what I said. I wanted to give you a few other sources, and then if you really want to get to the crust of things, from it's not new, I told you. It says the new Schaff-Herzog Encyclopedia of Religious Knowledge. It's not really new, as you can tell. But I love the way this article opens on Christmas. This is the way this article opens. The supposed anniversary of the birth of Jesus Christ. Da, 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 da. Okay? So when people say, how could you say that? Well, when I say I'm not the only one, I'm not the only one. In fact, from some very unlikely sources. If you're ready for this, I mean, you know, I printed this off because I just thought, well, it's pretty remarkable. You never know what's going to come out of the Pope's mouth. This is Pope Benedict XVI. This was an article, I think, from Time, but it was given, the actual article was given to the Telegraph News, I believe. And it says here that Pope Benedict XVI has revealed in the third installment of his trilogy dedicated to the life of Christ, that Jesus may have been born earlier than previously thought. We'll get to that. The calendar we use, which commences with the birth of Christ, which was created by Dionysius, I got to say this right, Exiguus, in the 6th, he's a 6th century monk, may be mistaken. So this is kind of like huge progress for someone that is stuck in that big of a block of you can't blink or move to even acknowledge that the date might be wrong. Now, that's the Pope, but then there are other prominent scholars, prominent, credible scholars, such as Joseph Fitzmyer, and it didn't come out of this book, I grabbed the wrong one, but there is a book that I have with articles, and he comes to the conclusion not only that the birth of Christ in December, Catholic scholar, hello, is dubious, highly untenable, and simply propagated because it's the mindset if you can't beat him, join him, which is basically how the early church came to that. Now, the logical mind's going to say, so what are you trying to tell me? Well, first of all, you can't stop the world. I'm not here to educate the world. There's a very small amount of people who actually want to know the truth. And Jesus said, you shall know the truth shall set you free. But you've got to want to know what that truth is, even if it appears contrary to what the common people hold as true. Because I go back to this person who was mortified at my speech, mortified. I could tell, like, there was a state of shock, like, how could this be? And the reality is that no one has spent the time to truly investigate. We just go with "We Three Kings." We like that song. There must have been 3 kings, right? No. All right, here we go. So in Matthew, we have a different type of account. We have the genealogies. Matthew seems to like groups of numbers in his genealogies. And then he gets to the birth of Christ, the Annunciation, the birth of Christ. Chapter 2. Now, when Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, and Matthew's careful to add Bethlehem of Judea as opposed to another Bethlehem elsewhere, which there was, in the days of Herod the king. People who don't read the Bible carefully will go absolutely nuts about these small details when you start telling them something about, oh, no. In the days of Herod the king. Now, we know that Herod died in 4 BC. So, Jesus was born. Don't you love that? You already see that there's a flaw in the calendar. Jesus is born before the death of Herod, and Herod died in 4 BC. You go figure that one out later. All right. Behold, there came wise men. Do you read how many wise men came? Okay, well, good. There's a few wise people out there. there came wise men from the east to Jerusalem, saying, where is he that is born King of the Jews? For we have seen his star in the east, his star rising in the east, and are come to worship him. Now, I'm telling you, this is a tremendous insight here. They said they saw his star rising, if you will, in the east. And we know that these people had to be coming from Persia, Babylonia, somewhere over there, traveling and following, I love this, his star. And when you begin to look at these small pieces of information, many people who study the stars will tell you it had to happen December 25th on such a year, because that was the year that Virgo, or that Jupiter and Saturn lined up. And although I completely believe in the gospel and the stars, there's no doubt in my mind, but most people don't understand that they want to pinpoint it and fix it at December 25th. So the ideas of people proposing that it was a comet, or Kepler, he did all of his study on the stars according to certain principles that began by biblical study. But all of these theories start in the wrong place. You've got to start at the absolute known fact. And what's the known fact? That somewhere back there in the Old Testament, a prophecy is given in Numbers talking about the star. And that prophecy given in Numbers is being unfolded here. Whether you want to call it, whatever you want to call it, but people have tried to the starting point is, let's study the stars and see if we can trace back the alignment of the stars, and you're going to end up on a wild goose chase. Although, as I said, I believe in the Gospels of the stars. Psalm 19 talks about how God put the stars in order. And the book of Job talks about Orion and Bear, way before we had any maps of understanding. So believe me, these folks knew all too well about the sky and the stars. They saw his star rising in the east, and they came to worship him. When Herod the king had heard these things, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. Why would he be troubled? Why would King Herod be troubled? Because, if you know history, these are all the little missing ingredients of things. If you know history, Herod was not liked by the Jews. Don't say Herod was a Jew, because even though he was born of a Jewish father, he was born of an Arab mother, and the Jews did not consider him a Jew. And he always had to, even though he's considered king of the Jews, he had to fight, and he was considered an evil king. He had to fight to get any type of respect. You read the history and you'll find it out for yourself. So he's troubled by this, and all Jerusalem with him. Well, why? Every mother in Israel was waiting for the Savior to be born. Why be troubled about this thing? And when he gathered all the chief priests and scribes of the people together, he demanded of them where Christ should be born. That tells you all you need to know, because a real Jew studying what only existed then, which was the Old Testament, would have known the prophecy of Micah, which they're going to cite to him. They said unto him, in Bethlehem of Judea, for it is written by the prophet, and thou, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are not least among the princes of Judah, for out of thee shall come a governor, and he shall rule, or he shall shepherd my people Israel. Then Herod, when he'd privily called the wise men, do you read how many there were yet? All right. Inquired of them diligently what time the star appeared. That's another anomaly. There were no city lights. There was no smog. So that means every person, wherever you lived, you could be out there at any given time looking up and seeing the sky for yourself, as clear as jewels shining out in the darkness. So the fact that he's inquiring what time the star appears, like, hello, where were you? And he sent them to Bethlehem. This is the other anomaly. We're only talking about 5 or 10 miles distance from where they were to where the child is supposedly going to be. And he says, you go. Like, it's a long distance. You guys go. But they just probably traveled maybe a couple 100 miles. You guys go. Very close by. It's very strange. But go and search diligently for the young child. You know, as if Bethlehem is going to be that big, right? It's not like, hey, we're in New York City. Go find that kid somewhere. Huh? Get the picture. The population, as populous as it was, isn't as populous as New York City, the density. So all of this is kind of somewhat strange. And when you found him, bring me word again that I may come and worship him also. When they had heard the king, they departed, and lo, the star which they saw in the east went before them, till it came and stood over where the young child was. And this is the thing that I'm referring to out of Numbers. When people talk about the star, and people say it was a comet, and there's all kinds of, it was a supernova. Okay, well, tell me how something just comes to a standstill where the child is. We'll leave that one alone for a minute, because I don't even want to take up that subject right now. When they saw the star, they rejoiced with exceeding great joy. And when they were come into the house, do you read that they are still in a manger? That's Luke's gospel is telling that early portion. Here the child, young child, they saw the young child, and Mary, with Mary his mother, fell down and worshipped him. Now, let me just talk about this for a minute. There are 3 gifts being talked about: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Just because there are 3 gifts, it doesn't mean there were 3 kings. We 3 kings, right? So, you hear that, oh yeah, that's what it was. There were 3 kings. We're going to make a nativity set, and we're going to have 3 kings. But if you understand what they were traveling with and the value of what they were traveling with across those couple hundred miles they journeyed, believe you me, they wouldn't be 3 traveling. There'd be a whole caravan, like Wells Fargo back in the day, like the Pony Express back in the day. There wouldn't be 3 people just traveling. What's even more, I resent these things, the people not paying attention. Moreover, we see in all of these depictions on cards, we see them riding on camels, which they may have been, I don't know. I'm not going to go there. Don't want to talk about that one. But we see them kneeling down on bended knee. That's pretty much how you see them. But as was customary for these people, to come and worship meant prostrate. That meant palms down, face down to the ground. You ever see a picture of 3 men doing that? No, didn't think so. I mean, it's all of these subtle little things, but you do enough of these small, subtle little things, and suddenly you don't even end up with what's really there. Okay, they bring gifts, and being warned of God in a dream that they should not return to Herod, they departed into their own country another way. And that's the last we hear of them. Now, what I omitted to say is that between Matthew's account of the Magi and Luke's account of the shepherds, what's interesting is that the shepherds were people of that country. They went, they saw, they went and they told other people, they praised God. Here, people came from afar. Now, I don't know if these men came from a lineage of men that maybe grew up around the area where Daniel was, or maybe further on, but these came from afar, and there's something very typical even in that, recognizing those who were right there, shepherds, who should have known this is the Christ child, this is the king, versus those that came from afar who worshiped. And isn't that basically how the faith goes? People who are closest to it can't even see it. Those people who should know the scriptures, referring to those in the Jewish custom, cannot see. But those who come from afar and outside of that realm, they recognize and they came to worship. So what does this tell you about what I'm trying to say? In the big picture, what we glean, we can know this. As one of these books said, well, it's highly dubious that they'd be tending their sheep in the middle of winter. The bigger issue is if you read both accounts, and I will let you do that study in your own time. If you read both accounts, you're going to come up with a couple of indiscrepancies. The Herod versus the census that was being taken up, and there's a lot of talk, a lot of scholars debate, well, it can't be this, and the census that came at this time is too late, and this one's too early. Put that all aside for a minute, because you can go crazy with that subject. The main one I want to ask you is this. If you were looking to have a census and tax people, would you do it at Hanukkah time? Well, did Jesus even know what that was? Yeah, of course he did. I'll just read this one passage to you that tells you that, of course, Jesus knows what Hanukkah is. It was celebrated from before his birth and onward. But just write this down somewhere. In John 10:22, and it was at Jerusalem, the Feast of Dedication, and it was winter. The Feast of Dedication is Hanukkah. That's what Hanukkah means, dedication, rededication. That is the only place, believe it or not, the Tanakh does not contain this information because this happened between testaments. But it's right here. So what am I saying to you? If you were going to tax people, would you tax them and have them come for a census? Either one, at Hanukkah time, which candles had not yet been established, by the way. I mean, you have to hear me out on this. Or would you tax people when they've done their harvest and it's closer to harvest time, where they still got lots of grain, lots of bread? If you were going to tax people and take a census, it's a census under the guise that we want to know how many of you are here so we can then tax you. That's really the way it worked. So the question is asked. These are all these small things that you examine to come back to the one thing that is obvious. Jesus was not born December 25th. You know the picture you see of the manger? Oh, Pastor, stop, you're killing me. You know the picture you see of Jesus in the manger, and there's the ox, and there's what's called the crib, or in the French, la crèche. That was the contribution of St. Francis of Assisi. He came up with that, probably in a mistranslation of ox and ass, mistranslation out of Isaiah 1:3 and Habakkuk. So, you know, we can read these things. There was no room at the inn, but let me ask you something. If it's tabernacle time, if it's Sukkot, and people have all moved out of their home, doesn't it make sense? There's no room at the inn. They're all going somewhere. Now, don't think the way Judaism might operate today, because they bent a lot of rules in that day. But we know one thing, that this most important message is summed up in this. If God fulfills his set times, Passover, Jesus is our Passover, unleavened bread being fulfilled in Christ as a life without sin in sincerity, Jesus, first fruit, he is the first fruit of the resurrected from the dead. 1 Corinthians 15 speaks of this. He is fulfilling the Feast of Trumpets now and when he comes again, atonement and tabernacles. Then I would just say this to you. The true meaning, if you're going to talk about Christmas, taking the word Christmas into this particular time frame, at a right month, at a right particular time, is that God tabernacled amongst us for a time. And when he told his disciples, I've got to leave, but I'll send another one to be with you, Christ is now tabernacling. His Spirit tabernacles with us. And that, if you will, that great time continues on. Now, when you see the meaning of that, Christ kin with us, Christ came in the flesh, displaying all of these ideas about joy and peace and family, you might say, well, those are wonderful ideas. There's nothing wrong with celebrating your friends and your family and love, but if you're going to talk about the meaning of something, go to the real meaning of it. Now, the first church understood this, and this church today doesn't seem to get this. People like Chrysostom said, well, we're celebrating his birth because without the birth of Christ, there wouldn't be, and he goes down to then the resurrection, ultimately. But that's reverse, because every mother in Israel believed they were going to give birth to the Savior. So the real thinking is, Christ came, he fulfilled all the things that the Old Testament describes, came to do what he said he was going to do, which is fix something that was wrong with the people, that only his death could fix and atone for. And if that occurred, and that did occur, well, it's wonderful to say all these other things, including the fact that he shall be born of a virgin, they shall call his name Emmanuel. All of those things are beautiful, but the true embodiment of it all is not about celebrating the birth of a child. It's about celebrating the fact that he came in the flesh. The early church fathers fought bitterly over this. I taught on this one time. Remember the message on an eye? Homeoousis versus homeoiosis. That one I in a letter that caused great contention. Was he the same essence as God, or was he just like? The early church was more concerned about striving to truly identify Christ. And this pagan celebration, by the way, Saturnalia, Brumalia, Juvenalia, Mithras, all of these different festivities that went on, the winter solstice, all occurred December 25th. Go back and read history. You don't need to read somebody like Hislop. Go back and read history, and you find out that even people like a straight-laced, this is F.C. Conybeare, fellow Oxford College, fellow of the British Academy, officier d'Académie. You read these straight-laced people who will tell in great detail about the festivities of the winter solstice, of the Saturnalia, not far-flung ideas, but what was really going on. And the church realized we cannot not only not stop this, but hey, what a great way to bring people into the church. Now let me ask you a question. Isn't that what people are still doing today, when instead of telling people about the gospel of Jesus Christ and the fulfillment of prophecy and how God is faithful to his word, we'd prefer to lure you in by playing an NFL game, and then maybe you'll stay for a message. Isn't that the same thing that goes on today? That's why I stand here telling you the true meaning of this holiday, which did not occur December 25th, but occurred in September, is that he tabernacled among us. And in that moment, putting on display God for all to see, telling us all we could know about the Father in the flesh, and giving us a future indication that when he does come back, Zechariah 14, he will make all of these people who did not listen, who did not heed, come and fulfill and celebrate the Feast of Tabernacles. Now, what is the Feast of Tabernacles? But moving out of your house, your residence, into a temporary structure, and offerings, 203 offerings for 1,000 years. So when you think about it, when God says these are the set times, and they are set in eternity, it's not that it just stopped with the Jews wandering and therefore they didn't have to celebrate. Even the Jews today celebrate Sukkot, Tabernacles. They still keep the Feast of Tabernacles. And I'm telling you, this is the celebration people should be talking about. Do you hear people walking around, even if it's misplaced now? Let's bring it back into December for a minute. And even if it's misplaced, do you hear people saying, I'm glad that Christ came to tabernacle and take up a tent of human flesh that he could save me? No, the only savings that you're looking at are maybe 50 to 60% off. So what I want you to leave with is this. It's a hard message for some of us who were brought up in the realm of what traditionally is celebrated as Christmas. It's hard to buck what goes on. I've told you before, have a party. Gather with your friends, gather with your family. In fact, too bad that people don't embody that love and fellowship all year round. We'd be a different type of people. It still would not be the message. Now, if you want the real Christmas message that no one ever preaches, I'll tell you what it is, and I've never heard anybody preach it. What's the first message spoken from heaven to earth? You'll find it in Luke. After the message is given to Zacharias, after the message is given to Mary, the first message given to the general public is the shepherds in the field. And what's the message that occurs in Luke 2 and verse 10? Fear not. Fear not. Don't be afraid. I don't know too many Christians that even embody that, because most of the people I meet are too cowardly to look at this and say, there's a reason why. Behold, I bring you good tidings of great joy. The Evangelion is being announced. Before the Evangelion's announced, the first word from heaven to earth, fear not. Now, how many times have you heard that being proclaimed as a Christmas message? Instead of peace on earth. And Jesus didn't say he came to bring peace. He said he came to bring a sword. This is what happens when you don't study the Bible. You get a whole bunch of people that will look at me and go, wow, she's pretty messed up. No. I'm not the messed up one, because all my information is coming from this book. And not some, as I tried to tell this one person, I said, this does not require linguistics. This doesn't require Greek and Hebrew, and this just requires that you open the book and you read it. No three kings. Check out where the star is coming from, as the song says, westward, wrong direction. And start living by what this book says. Jesus said, you have made void the word of God by your traditions. I don't want traditions. Now, I'm not telling people stop having a Christmas party. The Puritans did that in 1647. They banned, in Boston, they banned the celebration. You would be fined I think it was 5 shillings. They're still operating on English money if you were found celebrating Christmas. When you really realize, and they took it to the far extreme, but their whole thing was they thought that this was an invention. And they recognized that the worship that was coming out of this wasn't worship unto the Lord, but warped and caricatured reveling, which had nothing to do about the very celebration, even at the wrong time of the year, about the one who kinned himself to us, that we might be reconciled to God. Now there is the message. I hope you don't leave here thinking, oh, my Pastor Scott just ruined my life. I should tell you this one last thing about the Feast of Tabernacles, just so you know. Customary for the Jews, the Feast of Tabernacles, in the many days celebrated, they have 3 different events, and I wrote them down here. One of them is Hoshana Rabbah, on the 7th day of Sukkot, which is being translated, save, I pray. And then 2 things that happen on the last day, Shemini Azeret and Simchat Torah, which are the rejoicing in the Torah, Hatan Torah, the bridegroom of the Torah, and Hatan Bereshit, the bridegroom of Genesis. The Jews are celebrating, essentially, without knowing it, the Alpha and the Omega. Now that's quite a message for you. And that is my definition of why we should celebrate Christmas in September. That's my message, folks. You've been watching me, Pastor Melissa Scott, live from Glendale, California at Faith Center. If you would like to attend the service with us Sunday morning at 11 a.m., simply call 1-800-338-3030 to receive your pass. If you'd like more teaching and you'd like to go straight to our website, the address is www.pastormelissascott.com.